Defendant Chloe Morgan stands accused of theft of military property, unauthorized access to restricted areas, and possible espionage against the United States. Maximum penalty, 25 years in federal prison and forfeiture of citizenship. The trial counsel's voice echoed through the Article 32 hearing room at Naval Base Coronado like a hammer striking steel. Harsh fluorescent lights cast cold shadows across the defendant's table, where Chloe Morgan sat with silver handcuffs reflecting the unforgiving glare. Behind her, 20 SEAL rookies lined the gallery like spectators at a circus, phones discreetly recording, their muffled laughter drowning out even the ceiling fan's hum. Chloe wore a faded gray cardigan and simple black slacks, her brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked like any office worker you might pass on the street, except for those steady blue eyes that never blinked, never wavered as the bailiff removed her restraints, the kind of eyes that had seen things most people only imagined. Until the investigation officer recognized the call sign she was about to utter, and the entire base would snap to attention. The morning had started at 0530 hours for most personnel at Coronado, but for Chloe, it began much earlier. In the dim holding area adjacent to the courthouse, she'd gone through the standard pre-hearing procedures with mechanical precision: strip search, property inventory, transport to the building. The MPs had been professional but distant, treating her like any other contractor caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. What they didn't know was that this contractor had been planning this moment for 8 months. The courthouse hallway buzzed with activity as personnel prepared for what promised to be a routine hearing. Supply contractors caught stealing military equipment weren't exactly rare, and this case seemed particularly straightforward. A civilian with a temporary badge caught red-handed with 27 crates of tactical supplies meant for SEAL operations. "Make way for the defendant," Petty Officer Second Class Jake Morrison called out, his voice carrying the particular brand of arrogance that came with fresh trident pins. The SEAL rookie stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy, as Chloe was escorted past, still in handcuffs, flanked by 2 bailiffs. "Look at that," whispered Seaman Rodriguez to his buddy. "Contractor thinks she can just walk into our house and take whatever she wants." Several others chuckled, phones already out, and recording what they assumed would be an entertaining morning of justice served. Captain James Rourke emerged from a side office, his dress blues immaculate, ribbons arranged in perfect rows across his chest. At 42, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd earned his rank through 2 decades of naval service, including multiple deployments with special operations units. His eyes found Chloe briefly as she passed, and something flickered across his expression. Too quick for the rookies to catch, but not quick enough to escape notice entirely. "Civilian contractor think they own the place," he muttered, just loud enough for the gallery to hear. But his grip on the manila folder in his hands was white-knuckled, and when he thought no one was looking, he checked his watch for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. Chloe's escort paused at the courthouse entrance while the bailiff reviewed paperwork. During this brief stop, several things happened that only a trained observer would notice. First, when the bailiff removed her handcuffs for the final time, Chloe automatically checked the fit and closure mechanism, not with the fumbling curiosity of someone unfamiliar with restraints, but with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been trained in their use and removal. Second, while most detainees would have rubbed their wrists or flexed their fingers after extended restraint, Chloe simply clasped her hands behind her back and stood at what could only be described as a modified position of attention. Her feet were precisely shoulder-width apart, weight evenly distributed, spine straight but not rigid. Third, when handed her visitor's badge to replace the one confiscated during arrest, she clipped it to her cardigan with her left hand, while her right remained steady at her side. But for just a moment, as she reached for the badge, the edge of her cardigan shifted, revealing the corner of what looked very much like a common access card on a retractable cord, military green instead of civilian blue. The rookies missed all of this. They were too busy composing captions for their social media posts and arguing about who had the best angle for video. "All rise for the investigation officer," the bailiff announced as they entered the courtroom proper. The Article 32 hearing room at Coronado was smaller than most civilian courtrooms, but carried the weight of military tradition in every detail. The American flag stood in the corner alongside the Navy Jack, and the investigation officer's bench bore the seal of the United States Navy in burnished brass. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, Judge Advocate General's Corps, entered with the measured pace of someone accustomed to being the highest-ranking person in the room. Her silver oak leaves caught the light as she took her position behind the bench, scanning the assembled personnel with the calculating gaze of a career lawyer who had seen every possible permutation of military justice. The prosecution table held Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, trial counsel, whose reputation for aggressive prosecution had earned her the nickname Barracuda among junior officers. Her briefcase was arranged with military precision, documents tabbed and indexed for instant access. At the defense table sat Lieutenant Jake Williams, defense counsel, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Court-appointed counsel for contractor theft cases rarely offered much opportunity for career advancement, and his body language suggested he viewed this as little more than a procedural formality before inevitable conviction. The gallery held the SEAL rookies, a few senior NCOs who'd wandered in to watch the show, and a sprinkling of base personnel with time to kill. In the front row, almost hidden behind a pillar, sat a woman in civilian clothes who'd shown no identification to the bailiff but somehow hadn't been asked to leave. As everyone settled into their seats, Chloe took her place at the defendant's table, with movements that, once again, seemed just slightly too precise for a civilian contractor. She didn't check the chair before sitting, didn't look around nervously, didn't fidget with her clothes or hair. Instead, she faced forward with the same steady composure she'd maintained since her arrest 3 days earlier. "This Article 32 hearing will come to order," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes announced. "Lieutenant Commander Chen, please read the charges." Trial counsel stood, her voice carrying easily to every corner of the room. The defendant, Chloe Morgan, civilian contractor, stands accused of violations under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, specifically Article 86, unauthorized absence from place of duty, Article 91, willful disobedience of a superior commissioned officer, and Article 94, theft of military property exceeding $5,000 in value. She paused for effect, scanning the gallery where phones were discreetly recording every word. Additionally, the defendant is charged under Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. Section 794, which addresses gathering or delivering defense information to foreign nations. The government alleges that between March 15th and June 23rd of this year, the defendant did willfully and unlawfully remove from authorized storage 27 crates of tactical equipment valued at approximately $400,000, with intent to deliver said materials to unauthorized parties. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. $400,000 worth of SEAL equipment was serious money, and the espionage charges elevated this from simple theft to potential treason. "How does the defendant plead?" Lieutenant Colonel Hayes asked, turning her attention to the defense table. Defense counsel stood slowly. "Your Honor, my client reserves the right to enter a plea pending review of the government's evidence. However, we would note for the record that Ms. Morgan maintains her complete innocence of all charges. So noted, Lieutenant Commander Chen, you may proceed with opening statements." The trial counsel's opening was everything the gallery had hoped for, and more. She painted a picture of betrayal that cut to the heart of military culture. A civilian contractor who'd exploited the trust placed in her to access the most sensitive equipment used by America's elite warriors. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is not simply theft," Chen declared, her voice rising with practiced outrage. "What we have is a violation of the sacred trust between those who serve and those who support the mission." The defendant was granted access to restricted areas based on her role as a logistics coordinator. She used that access to systematically remove equipment that could have meant the difference between life and death for our operators in the field. She gestured toward the SEAL rookies in the gallery. These young warriors have earned the right to carry the trident through months of the most demanding training known to military science. They trust that when they're sent into harm's way, their equipment will be there, will function properly, will give them every possible advantage against those who would do harm to our nation. The rookies straightened in their seats, feeling the weight of their recent graduation from basic underwater demolition SEAL training. They'd earned those trident pins through 25 weeks of physical and mental challenges that eliminated more than 70% of candidates. The idea that some contractor could simply walk off with their gear was deeply offensive. The defendant exploited that trust, Chen continued. She took advantage of her position, her access, and her knowledge of base security procedures to steal equipment that belongs not just to the Navy, but to every American who sleeps safely at night, knowing that warriors like these stand ready to defend freedom. It was a good opening, and Chen knew it. The gallery was hanging on every word. phones capturing her passionate defense of military honor. Even some of the more senior personnel were nodding along. But throughout the entire 15-minute presentation, Chloe Morgan sat perfectly still. She didn't take notes, didn't whisper to her counsel, didn't react visibly to any of the accusations. Her hands remained folded on the table in front of her, and her eyes never left trial counsel's face. It was the kind of focus that made some people nervous. When Chen finished and returned to her seat, defense counsel stood for what everyone expected to be a perfunctory response. Court-appointed attorneys in cases this straightforward rarely had much to work with. "Your Honor," Lieutenant Williams began, "the defense reserves the right to present our case when the government has completed theirs. However, I would note that my client has been cooperative throughout this process and looks forward to the opportunity to address these charges fully." It was bland, professional, and entirely unremarkable, exactly what everyone expected from a lawyer going through these motions before an inevitable plea deal. "Very well," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes said. "Lieutenant Commander Chen, call your first witness." The government calls Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez to the stand. A weathered Hispanic man in his late 40s rose from the gallery and approached the witness stand. His uniform bore the anchors and stars of the Navy's most senior enlisted rank, along with enough ribbons to indicate extensive combat experience. This was someone who'd earned his position through decades of exemplary service. After being sworn in, Master Chief Rodriguez settled into the witness chair with the easy confidence of someone comfortable with its authority. "Master Chief," trial counsel began, "please state your current assignment and how long you've been stationed at Coronado." "Ma'am, I'm the Senior Enlisted Advisor for Naval Special Warfare Group 1. I've been at this command for 3 years, and I've been in the Navy for 26 years total. In that capacity, do you have oversight responsibility for tactical equipment used by SEAL teams?" "Yes, ma'am. All equipment procurement, maintenance, and accountability falls under my purview." "Were you present during the inventory conducted on June 24th that revealed missing equipment?" "I was, ma'am. We conducted a full audit of sensitive items and discovered 27 crates of tactical gear were unaccounted for." Trial counsel moved to her evidence table and retrieved a thick folder. "Master Chief, I'm showing you what's been marked as Government Exhibit 1. Can you identify this document?" Rodriguez examined the paperwork carefully. "Yes, ma'am. This is the inventory shortage report I filed with the commanding officer. It lists all missing items by stock number, description, and value. And what was the total value of missing equipment? $407,235, ma'am." The number hit the gallery like a physical blow. Several rookies whistled low under their breath. That was serious money, enough to buy houses in some parts of the country. "Master Chief, were you able to determine how this equipment went missing?" "Yes, ma'am. Security footage showed the defendant removing crates from the restricted storage facility on multiple occasions between March and June. She had legitimate access due to her contractor status, but the removal was unauthorized." "No further questions, Your Honor." Defense counsel's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. He established that Rodriguez hadn't personally witnessed any of the alleged thefts and that the inventory system wasn't perfect, but failed to make any significant dents in the government's case. As Rodriguez returned to his seat, several things happened in quick succession. First, Chloe's eyes followed the Master Chief's movement with the kind of attention usually reserved for potential threats. Second, when Rodriguez passed within 6 feet of the defendant's table, he slowed his pace almost imperceptibly, and his eyes flicked toward Chloe's face. And third, for just a moment, their eyes met, and something passed between them that neither the gallery nor the legal teams caught. "The government calls Petty Officer First Class Thompson to the stand," trial counsel announced. A young man in his late 20s approached the witness stand. His uniform was crisp, his bearing professional, but there was something in his expression that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with his role in the proceedings. "Petty Officer Thompson, please state your current assignment." "Ma'am, I'm the warehouse supervisor for restricted tactical equipment at Naval Special Warfare Group 1. In that capacity, did you work with the defendant?" "Yes, ma'am." Ms. Morgan was assigned as liaison for contractor logistics support. She coordinated deliveries and maintained inventory records for civilian-supplied items. "Did her duties require access to the restricted storage facility?" "Yes, ma'am, but only for specific items and only with proper authorization." Trial counsel moved closer to the witness. "Petty Officer Thompson, were you present on June 8th when the defendant accessed the facility?" Thompson shifted uncomfortably. Yes, ma'am. Please describe what you observed. Well, ma'am, Ms. Morgan presented her access card and requested entry to verify inventory on some communications equipment. I escorted her into the facility per standard procedure. And what happened then? She went directly to the communications section and began checking serial numbers against her paperwork. Everything seemed normal. Did you maintain visual contact with the defendant throughout her visit? Another uncomfortable shift. Not continuously, ma'am. I had other duties to attend to, and she seemed to know what she was doing. How long was she in the facility unescorted? Approximately 20 minutes, ma'am. And during that time, she had access to the tactical equipment that subsequently went missing? Yes, ma'am. The implication was clear, and the gallery absorbed it with growing hostility toward the defendant. Here was a contractor who'd exploited the trust of a young sailor to steal equipment meant to protect American lives. But during defense counsel's cross-examination, some interesting details emerged. Petty Officer Thompson, you testified that the defendant went directly to the communications section. Did she ask for directions? No, sir. Did she consult any maps or facility diagrams? No, sir. So she knew exactly where to go in a facility that covers approximately 10,000 square feet? Thompson hesitated. Yes, sir. And when she was checking serial numbers, did she have to search for them? Or did she know exactly where to look? She knew where to look, sir. Almost like she'd been there before. Objection, trial counsel interrupted. Speculation. Sustained, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes ruled. But the seed was planted. How did a contractor know her way around a restricted facility so thoroughly? As the morning progressed, the government presented a steady stream of evidence that painted an increasingly damning picture. Security footage showed Chloe accessing the facility on multiple occasions. Her electronic signature appeared on inventory documents for items that were subsequently discovered missing. Her contractor identification had been used to bypass security checkpoints during times when no authorized visits were scheduled. But with each piece of evidence, the defense managed to elicit small details that didn't quite fit the narrative of a simple theft. Chloe's movements through the facility were too purposeful, too efficient. She never hesitated, never backtracked, never appeared to be learning the layout. Her paperwork was always perfect, her procedures always correct. It was almost like she'd been trained for this kind of operation. The most damaging testimony came from Lieutenant Junior Grade Sarah Park, the base security officer who had overseen the investigation. Lieutenant Park, trial counsel began, please describe the defendant's behavior when she was apprehended. Ma'am, on June 23rd at approximately 14:30 hours, I approached Ms. Morgan in the parking lot adjacent to the restricted storage facility. She was loading a crate into a civilian vehicle. How did she react to your approach? She remained calm, ma'am. When I identified myself and requested to inspect the crate, she complied immediately. And what did you find? Night vision equipment, encrypted communications gear, and specialized medical supplies, all items that had been reported missing from the facility. Did the defendant offer any explanation? She stated that she was transporting the items for inspection and maintenance per her contractor agreement. Did you verify this claim? Yes, ma'am. There was no record of any scheduled maintenance or inspection for those items. The noose was tightening, and everyone in the courtroom could feel it. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony consistent, and the defendant's behavior throughout suggested either guilt or shocking indifference to her fate. But then trial counsel made what she thought would be the final blow. Lieutenant Park, based on your investigation, what is your professional assessment of the defendant's actions? Park straightened in her chair. Ma'am, in my opinion, this represents a sophisticated intelligence operation designed to remove high-value tactical equipment from military custody. The defendant's knowledge of facility layout, security procedures, and equipment locations suggests extensive pre-operational planning. And what conclusions do you draw from that assessment? Ma'am, I believe we're dealing with either corporate espionage or foreign intelligence gathering. No ordinary contractor could have executed this operation without significant support and training. It was the espionage angle that trial counsel had been building toward all morning, not just theft, but potential treason. The gallery absorbed this with visible shock, and several of the SEAL rookies were now looking at Chloe with something approaching hatred. Throughout all of this testimony, through hours of evidence and accusation, Chloe Morgan maintained the same steady composure. She took no notes, made no objections, showed no emotion. When particularly damaging evidence was presented, she didn't flinch. When witnesses described her actions in terms that suggested sophisticated intelligence training, she didn't react. It was either the behavior of someone completely innocent or someone with extraordinary self-control. The lunch recess provided an opportunity for the gallery to discuss what they'd heard, and the consensus was overwhelmingly against the defendant. The SEAL rookies were particularly vocal in their condemnation. "Corporate spy makes sense," Petty Officer Morrison declared during lunch. "No way some random contractor knows that much about our operations without help." "I heard her security clearance was temporary," added Seaman Rodriguez. "Probably fake credentials, too." The conversation continued in this vein, with each rookie trying to outdo the others in expressing outrage at the violation of military trust. They were young, idealistic, and recently graduated from training that had emphasized honor, courage, and commitment as the core values of naval service. The idea that someone could infiltrate their community for profit was deeply offensive. But Captain Rourke, sitting alone at a table near the window, wasn't participating in the conversation. Instead, he was staring out at the harbor, where gray ships rode at anchor in the afternoon sun. His lunch sat untouched in front of him, and he checked his watch repeatedly. When court reconvened at 13:30 hours, trial counsel announced that the government was ready to rest its case. The evidence was comprehensive, the testimony overwhelming, and the defendant's guilt seemed certain. It was then that defense counsel surprised everyone. "Your Honor, the defense calls Captain James Rourke to the stand." The gallery stirred with interest. Rourke wasn't on the witness list, and his connection to the case wasn't obvious. He'd been present during some of the proceedings, but hadn't testified during the government's case. Rourke approached the witness stand with the measured pace of a senior officer, but those watching closely might have noticed a slight tremor in his hands as he raised his right hand to be sworn in. "Captain Rourke, please state your current assignment." "I'm the commanding officer of Special Boat Team 22, and I serve as liaison for contractor logistics support to Naval Special Warfare Group 1. In that capacity, do you work with civilian contractors?" "Yes, sir. Contractors provide essential support for equipment maintenance, facility management, and specialized services that augment our military capabilities." "Are you familiar with the defendant?" Rourke's eyes flicked toward Chloe for the first time since testimony began. "Yes, sir." "In what capacity?" "Ms. Morgan was assigned as our primary logistics coordinator for the past 8 months. "And in that role, did she have legitimate access to the equipment in question?" "Yes, sir. Her duties required regular access to verify inventory, coordinate maintenance, and ensure operational readiness of tactical equipment." This was unexpected. Defense counsel was suggesting that Chloe's access wasn't unauthorized after all, that her presence in the restricted facility was part of her legitimate duties. "Captain Rourke, are you aware of any instances where the defendant exceeded her authority or violated security protocols?" The question hung in the air for a long moment. Rourke looked directly at Chloe, and again, something passed between them that the gallery couldn't interpret. "No, sir," he said finally. "In my experience, Ms. Morgan has always operated within the parameters of her assignment." Trial counsel was on her feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness isn't qualified to testify about the defendant's activities outside his direct observation." "Sustained," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes ruled. "The jury will disregard the witness's characterization of activities he didn't personally observe, but the damage was done." Here was a respected naval officer suggesting that maybe the defendant's actions weren't as unauthorized as the government claimed. Defense counsel pressed his advantage. "Captain Rourke, based on your professional experience, would the defendant's knowledge of facility layout and security procedures be consistent with someone who had legitimate access over an extended period?" "Yes, sir. Anyone working in that environment for 8 months would naturally become familiar with procedures and layout." "No further questions, Your Honor." Trial counsel's cross-examination was aggressive, clearly designed to undermine Rourke's credibility and restore the narrative of unauthorized access. "Captain Rourke, are you personally familiar with every aspect of Ms. Morgan's contractor agreement?" "No, ma'am." "Are you aware of the specific items she was authorized to access?" "Not in detail, ma'am." "So, when you testified that her access was legitimate, you were speaking without complete knowledge of her actual authorization level?" Rourke hesitated. "That's correct, ma'am." "And you weren't present during any of the alleged thefts, were you?" "No, ma'am." "So, you have no direct knowledge of whether her actions on the dates in question were authorized or unauthorized?" "No, ma'am." It was effective cross-examination, and it restored some of the government's momentum. But it also raised questions about why defense counsel had called Rourke in the first place. If he couldn't provide direct testimony about the defendant's innocence, what was the point? The answer came during redirect examination. Captain Rourke, you mentioned that you've worked with Ms. Morgan for 8 months. During that time, have you had occasion to evaluate her professional competence? Yes, sir. And what is your assessment? She's exceptionally qualified, sir. Her knowledge of logistics procedures, equipment specifications, and operational requirements exceeds that of most military personnel I've worked with. In your professional opinion, would someone with her level of competence need to steal equipment to obtain access to it? Trial counsel started to object, but Rourke was already answering. No, sir. Someone with her qualifications and clearance level would have multiple legitimate avenues to obtain any equipment needed for legitimate purposes. It was a subtle point, but an important one. If Chloe was as qualified as Rourke suggested, why would she risk her career and freedom to steal equipment she could probably access legally? As afternoon wore on, defense counsel presented a series of character witnesses who testified to Chloe's professionalism, competence, and dedication to the mission. None of them could directly address the charges, but they painted a picture of someone who didn't fit the profile of a thief or spy. The most compelling testimony came from Senior Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos, who had worked closely with Chloe on equipment procurement. Ma'am, in my 20 years of service, I've worked with dozens of contractors. Ms. Morgan is in a class by herself. Her attention to detail, her understanding of operational requirements, and her commitment to supporting the mission are exceptional. Can you provide a specific example? Yes, ma'am. Last month, we had a critical equipment failure that threatened to delay a training exercise. Ms. Morgan worked through the night to source replacement parts and coordinate emergency delivery. The exercise proceeded on schedule because of her efforts. Did she receive any compensation for this extra effort? No, ma'am. She said supporting the mission was compensation enough. It was powerful testimony, and it began to shift the emotional dynamics in the courtroom. The SEAL rookies were still hostile, but some of the senior personnel were beginning to look thoughtful rather than simply angry. But the most dramatic moment came near the end of the afternoon session, when trial counsel made what she thought would be the decisive move. Your Honor, at this time the government would like to question the defendant directly about her qualifications and authority to access the equipment in question. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes looked to defense counsel. Any objection to the defendant testifying? No objection, Your Honor. In fact, my client is eager to address these charges directly. For the first time since the hearing began, Chloe Morgan rose from her chair. She moved to the witness stand with the same precise, measured steps she'd displayed all day, but now every eye in the courtroom was focused on her. The bailiff administered the oath, and Chloe settled into the witness chair with perfect posture and steady hands folded in her lap. Trial counsel approached with the confidence of a prosecutor who was about to deliver the knockout blow. Ms. Morgan, you've heard testimony today that you removed 27 crates of tactical equipment worth over $400,000 from a restricted military facility. Do you deny these allegations? I removed the equipment, yes. A collective intake of breath from the gallery. She was admitting to the theft. And you did so without authorization from military personnel? That's incorrect. Trial counsel paused, clearly not expecting this response. I'm sorry, are you claiming you had authorization? I'm stating that the premise of your question is incorrect. Ms. Morgan, please answer directly. Did you or did you not have written authorization to remove that equipment? Chloe looked directly at trial counsel, then at Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, then at the gallery full of SEAL rookies who had been mocking her all day. Counselor, you've been asking the wrong questions all day. The courtroom fell silent. Even the bailiff stopped shuffling papers. I beg your pardon, trial counsel said. You've been asking about my qualifications as a contractor, my access as a civilian, my authorization as a temporary employee. And you haven't asked about my rank. The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Trial counsel looked confused, defense counsel looked interested, and Lieutenant Colonel Hayes leaned forward with sharp attention. Morgan, you're a civilian contractor. You don't have a military rank. Is that a question or a statement, counselor? It's a statement of fact. Then you're mistaken. Trial counsel's confidence was beginning to crack. Ms. Morgan, what exactly are you claiming? Chloe took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice carried a different quality, something that made the senior military personnel in the gallery suddenly sit up straighter. "You asked about my rank, counselor. The answer is Admiral." The effect was immediate and devastating. Captain Rourke, who had been holding a plastic water cup, suddenly choked, spraying water across the front row. The cup slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through a courtroom that had gone absolutely silent. The SEAL rookies, who had been smirking and recording throughout the day, suddenly looked uncertain. Several of them lowered their phones and began shifting nervously in their seats. Trial counsel stared at Chloe as if she'd just claimed to be an alien from outer space. "I'm sorry, did you just say Admiral?" "Rear Admiral, lower half, United States Navy. Retired from active duty 18 months ago. Recalled to active duty 8 months ago under Title 10. United States Code, Section 688. The legal citation was precise, accurate, and delivered with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. Several of the senior personnel in the gallery were now looking distinctly uncomfortable. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes intervened before trial counsel could respond. "Ms. Morgan, those are serious claims. Do you have documentation to support this assertion?" "Yes, Your Honor, I do." "Bailiff, please retrieve the defendant's personal effects and examine them for military identification." The bailiff left the courtroom and returned 5 minutes later, carrying a small plastic bag. He opened it and removed a wallet, which he handed to Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. She opened it and went very still. After a long moment, she looked up at Chloe with an expression that had changed completely. "Bailiff, clear the gallery except for essential personnel. This hearing is now classified under Military Rule of Evidence 505. The SEAL rookies protested as they were escorted out, along with most of the spectators. Only the legal teams, court personnel, and a few senior officers remained. When the courtroom had been cleared, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes held up a military identification card. "The record will reflect that the defendant has presented valid military identification indicating the rank of Rear Admiral, United States Navy, with a current effective date." Trial counsel looked like someone had just told her the laws of physics had been repealed. "Your Honor, I request a recess to verify this information with the Navy Personnel Command." "Granted. This hearing is recessed until 0900 hours tomorrow morning. All personnel are reminded that the contents of this session are now classified and not to be discussed outside this courtroom." As the courtroom emptied, Captain Rourke approached the defense table where Chloe was gathering her things. "Admiral," he said quietly, "the signal worked perfectly." "The signal?" defense counsel asked. Chloe looked at both men with something that might have been amusement. "Captain Rourke and I arranged a recognition signal years ago. If I ever had to reveal my identity in a compromising situation, he would confirm receipt by dropping whatever he was holding. And why would you need such a signal?" "Because, counselor, sometimes the best way to catch thieves is to let them think they're stealing from you." As they walked out of the courthouse, defense counsel realized that everything he thought he knew about this case had just changed completely. And tomorrow morning, when the hearing resumed, he suspected the real story was going to be very different from what anyone had imagined. The evening briefing at Admiral Mitchell's quarters was attended by personnel whose names appeared on no public roster and whose assignments were classified well above the clearance level of most base personnel. The investigation that had been months in the planning was finally reaching its culmination, and the morning's hearing had been merely the opening gambit in a much larger operation. But that story would have to wait until tomorrow, when Rear Admiral Chloe Morgan would explain exactly why she had been willing to be arrested, charged with espionage, and humiliated in front of a gallery of SEAL rookies just to catch the real thieves who had been systematically looting the Navy's most sensitive equipment for over 2 years. The next morning brought an entirely different atmosphere to the Article 32 hearing room. Gone were the SEAL rookies with their phones and casual mockery. In their place sat personnel with security clearances that allowed them access to information most people would never know existed. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes entered the courtroom with a folder marked in red letters that everyone recognized but hoped never to see applied to their own cases. The classification level was so high that even mentioning it required special authorization. "This hearing will resume in closed session," she announced. "All personnel have been verified for appropriate clearance levels. Bailiff, ensure the room is secure." The bailiff activated electronic countermeasures that would prevent any recording devices from functioning and verified that all doors were properly sealed. What was about to be discussed could not leave this room. "Admiral Morgan," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes said, her tone now carrying the respect due to someone who outranked nearly everyone present. "The court has verified your identity and current status with Navy Personnel Command. You are indeed Rear Admiral Chloe Morgan, recalled to active duty under classified orders dated 8 months ago." Chloe stood at attention beside the defense table, no longer the humble contractor who had endured a day of accusations and mockery. Her bearing had shifted subtly but unmistakably, radiating the quiet authority of someone accustomed to commanding thousands of personnel and billions of dollars in assets. "Your Honor," she said, "I request permission to present classified evidence that will explain the circumstances surrounding the charges against me." "Permission granted. Trial counsel, do you object?" Lieutenant Commander Chen looked like someone who'd spent the night trying to understand how her slam dunk case had become a classified nightmare. "No objection, Your Honor, but I reserve the right to cross-examine on any evidence presented." "Understood. Admiral, you may proceed." A side door opened, and Assistant Secretary of the Navy Patricia Williams entered, carrying a briefcase that required 2 people to open due to its security locks. She approached the bench with the measured steps of someone carrying information that could affect national security. "Your Honor," Secretary Williams said, "I present sealed orders from the Chief of Naval Operations authorizing Operation Holdfast, a joint investigation between Naval Criminal Investigative Service, the Judge Advocate General's Corps, and the Defense Intelligence Agency." She placed a red envelope on the bench with both hands, never taking her eyes off Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. Hayes opened the envelope with the solemnity appropriate to documents that could change the course of careers and lives. As she read, her expression shifted from professional neutrality to something approaching amazement. "The court recognizes the validity of these orders," she announced. "Admiral Morgan, please explain your role in Operation Holdfast." Chloe moved to the center of the courtroom, and when she spoke, it was with the crisp efficiency of someone briefing senior leadership on matters of national importance. "Your Honor, 8 months ago, Naval Criminal Investigative Service identified irregularities in the supply chain for tactical equipment at multiple installations. Initial estimates suggested losses exceeding $10 million annually, but the pattern indicated systematic theft rather than simple administrative errors. She paused, allowing the magnitude of that number to sink in. $10 million wasn't just money. It was body armor that might not be available when a Marine needed it, night vision equipment that could mean the difference between mission success and failure, communications gear that connected isolated operators to support that could save their lives. The theft pattern was sophisticated, Chloe continued. Equipment would disappear from inventory systems without triggering automatic alerts. Paperwork would be falsified with electronic signatures that appeared legitimate. Most concerning, the missing equipment included items that could only be accessed by personnel with high-level security clearances. Trial counsel interrupted. "Your Honor, if the Admiral suspected internal theft, why not conduct a standard investigation?" "Because, Counselor, the thieves were using the standard investigation procedures to cover their tracks. Every time NCIS opened a case, evidence would disappear, witnesses would transfer to other assignments, and the investigation would stall. We needed a different approach." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes leaned forward. "Admiral, please explain how your arrest and prosecution fit into this operation." "Your Honor, I volunteered to serve as what intelligence services call a canary trap. We suspected that information about our investigation was being leaked to the thieves, so we created a scenario designed to flush out the source." She gestured toward the evidence table where 27 crates worth of equipment had been cataloged. "The equipment I removed wasn't stolen, Your Honor. It was bait. Each crate contained tracking devices that would allow us to follow the equipment to its ultimate destination. But more importantly, knowledge of the missing equipment was compartmentalized to a very small group of personnel." The implications were becoming clear, and several people in the courtroom were beginning to look uncomfortable. "The theory was simple," Chloe explained. "If information about the missing equipment reached the thieves, we would know the leak was coming from someone with access to that compartmentalized information. My arrest and prosecution served as additional bait, designed to pressure the thieves into accelerating their timeline." She pulled out a military specification tablet that looked nothing like civilian electronics. The screen was reinforced to military standards, the case designed to withstand battlefield conditions, and the security protocols were visible even to casual observers. "This device has been tracking the 27 crates since they were placed in evidence storage 3 days ago. The tracking data shows some very interesting movement patterns. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes examined the tablet's display, and her expression darkened. Bailiff, contact base security immediately. Tell them to secure evidence storage facility 2 and detain anyone attempting to access it. Yes, Your Honor. Admiral, please continue. Your Honor, the tracking data shows that someone accessed the evidence storage facility at 0230 hours this morning. 6 of the 27 crates were removed and transported to a warehouse facility approximately 12 miles from this base. She touched the tablet screen, bringing up a real-time map display. The warehouse is registered to Atlasware Defense Contracting, a company that holds multiple contracts for equipment maintenance and refurbishment. However, our investigation has revealed that Atlasware has been systematically replacing legitimate military equipment with inferior counterfeit items, then selling the genuine equipment on international markets. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear, and it was far larger than anyone had imagined. This wasn't just theft. It was a systematic compromise of military readiness that could have gotten American service members killed. The counterfeit equipment is sophisticated enough to pass initial inspection, but fails under combat conditions. A Marine in Afghanistan dies because his body armor was replaced with substandard materials. A SEAL team loses communications during a critical mission because their radios were swapped for counterfeits that look identical but lack the encryption capabilities of genuine equipment. Captain Rourke requested permission to address the court. Your Honor, I believe I can provide additional context that may be relevant to Admiral Morgan's testimony. Permission granted. Captain, please approach the witness stand. As Rourke was sworn in, Chloe noticed that his hands were steadier than they had been the previous day. The stress of maintaining his cover was finally over. Captain Rourke, Defense Counsel began, please explain your relationship with Admiral Morgan and Operation Holdfast. Sir, 18 months ago, I was approached by personnel from NCIS who suspected that someone in my command was involved in equipment theft. They asked for my cooperation in identifying the source. And did you agree to cooperate? Initially, no, sir. The accusation seemed impossible. My unit has an exemplary record, and the idea that one of my people might be stealing equipment was difficult to accept. What changed your mind? Rourke's expression hardened. My son, sir. He's 8 years old, and he has a rare medical condition that requires expensive treatment. 3 months ago, someone approached me with an offer to help with his medical bills in exchange for facilitating certain equipment transfers. The courtroom went silent. Here was the human element that made these conspiracies possible, the leverage that turned honest people into accomplices. I reported the approach to NCIS immediately, Rourke continued. That's when I learned about Operation Holdfast and Admiral Morgan's role. I was asked to participate in the operation by pretending to cooperate with the thieves while gathering evidence. Captain, that must have been an extraordinarily difficult position. Yes, sir. But when I learned that counterfeit equipment might be responsible for casualties overseas, I knew I had to help stop it. Trial counsel rose for cross-examination, but her questions lacked the aggressive confidence of the previous day. Captain Rourke, you testified that you were approached about your son's medical bills. Can you identify the person who made this approach? Yes, ma'am. Marcus Webb, Senior Procurement Officer for Atlasware Defense Contracting. And do you have evidence of this approach? Yes, ma'am. I wore a recording device during all subsequent meetings as directed by NCIS. He produced a small digital recorder that had been concealed in his uniform shirt. Your Honor, I'd like to present the recordings from my meetings with Mr. Webb as Defense Exhibit 1. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes nodded, and the bailiff set up audio equipment. What followed was 40 minutes of recorded conversation that laid out the entire conspiracy in devastating detail. Webb's voice was casual, almost friendly, as he explained how the equipment swap worked. Legitimate military gear would be replaced with counterfeits during routine maintenance cycles. The genuine equipment would then be sold to foreign buyers who were willing to pay premium prices for authentic American military technology. The beauty of the system, Webb's recorded voice explained, is that the counterfeit equipment looks identical to the original. By the time anyone discovers the substitution, the paperwork trail has been obscured, and the genuine equipment is halfway around the world. The recording included specific details about upcoming transfers, payment methods, and the names of other personnel involved in the conspiracy. It was a prosecutor's dream and a defense contractor's nightmare. When the recording ended, trial counsel looked like she wished she could disappear. Your Honor, she said weakly, In light of this new evidence, the government requests a recess to evaluate our position regarding the charges against Admiral Morgan. Denied, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes said sharply. We're going to finish this right now. Admiral Morgan, do you have additional evidence to present? Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to call Senior Chief Petty Officer Santos to explain the technical aspects of the counterfeit equipment. Santos approached the witness stand with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades working with military technology. Her testimony was technical but devastating, explaining how the counterfeit equipment was sophisticated enough to fool initial inspection but would fail catastrophically under combat conditions. Ma'am, the counterfeit night vision equipment looks identical to genuine items, but the image resolution is approximately 60% of specification. In a combat situation, that difference could mean the difference between identifying a threat and missing it entirely. And the communications equipment? Even worse, ma'am. The counterfeit radios lack the encryption capabilities of genuine equipment. Anyone using them would be broadcasting in the clear, potentially compromising operational security for entire units. The human cost of the conspiracy was becoming clear, and several people in the courtroom looked genuinely shaken. But the most dramatic moment came when defense counsel announced his final witness. Your Honor, the defense calls Marcus Webb to the stand. Every head in the courtroom turned toward the gallery, but Webb wasn't there. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Webb from the adjoining conference room where he's been waiting. The door opened, and Marcus Webb entered flanked by 2 military police officers. He was a well-dressed man in his 50s, with the kind of smooth confidence that came from years of successful business dealings. But his confidence was showing cracks as he realized the scope of what was happening. Mr. Webb, defense counsel began after he was sworn in, are you the senior procurement officer for Atlasware Defense Contracting? I am, but I don't understand why I'm being called as a witness in this proceeding. Mr. Webb, are you familiar with the defendant, Admiral Morgan? Webb looked at Chloe with obvious confusion. I know a contractor named Chloe Morgan, but I wasn't aware of any military rank. And in what context do you know Ms. Morgan? She's been our primary contact for equipment maintenance contracts at this facility, defense counsel smiled. Mr. Webb, I'm going to play a recording of a conversation you had with Captain Rourke 3 weeks ago. Please listen carefully. Webb's expression changed as his own voice filled the courtroom, explaining the details of the equipment substitution scheme. As the recording continued, his face went pale, then red, then pale again. Mr. Webb, is that your voice on the recording? I need to speak with my attorney. Mr. Webb, did you or did you not offer to pay Captain Rourke's son's medical bills in exchange for facilitating equipment theft? I invoke my right to remain silent. Your Honor, I have no further questions for this witness. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes looked at Webb with the expression of someone who had just discovered something unpleasant on the bottom of her shoe. Mr. Webb, you are hereby informed that you are under investigation for conspiracy to commit theft of government property, fraud against the United States, and violations of the Arms Export Control Act. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right. The military police officers moved closer to Webb, who suddenly looked much smaller and less confident than when he had entered the room. Your Honor, trial counsel said, in light of the evidence presented, the government moves to dismiss all charges against Admiral Morgan. Motion granted. All charges against Rear Admiral Chloe Morgan are hereby dismissed with prejudice. But the proceedings were far from over. Admiral Morgan, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes continued, do you have recommendations regarding the other individuals involved in this conspiracy? Yes, Your Honor. Based on our investigation, I recommend immediate arrest warrants for 3 additional Atlasware employees, 2 civilian contractors at other installations, and 1 military member whose identity is contained in the classified annex to my report. She handed a sealed envelope to the bailiff, who delivered it to Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. I also recommend immediate inspection of all equipment supplied by Atlasware over the past 2 years, with priority given to items currently deployed in combat zones. The scope of the investigation was becoming clear, and it was massive. This wasn't just a local problem, it was a conspiracy that had potentially compromised military operations worldwide. Your Honor, Secretary Williams interjected, I've been authorized to inform the court that NCIS teams are currently executing search warrants at Atlasware facilities in 6 states. Additionally, Interpol has been notified regarding potential sales of stolen military equipment to foreign buyers. The real-time nature of the operation was impressive, and it demonstrated the level of planning that had gone into Operation Holdfast. Admiral Morgan, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes said, "This court owes you an apology for the treatment you received during the initial phases of this hearing." "No apology necessary, Your Honor. The treatment I received was exactly what we anticipated and planned for. It served to convince the conspirators that their operation remained undetected. Nevertheless, the record should reflect that you volunteered for an assignment that required you to endure false accusation, public humiliation, and the possibility of conviction for serious crimes." Chloe's expression softened slightly. "Your Honor, in 18 months of retirement, I watched the news every day, knowing that somewhere in the world, American service members were putting their lives on the line with equipment that might have been compromised. When NCIS asked for my help, there was never any question about my answer. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of someone who understood what service meant, not just to oneself, but to the thousands of people who depended on the integrity of the system." "Mr. Webb," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes said, turning her attention back to the Atlasware executive, "you have 10 seconds to decide whether you want to cooperate with this investigation or whether you prefer to take your chances with a federal jury." Webb looked around the courtroom, perhaps hoping for some avenue of escape that didn't exist. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The recordings were damning, and his Keo conspirators were being arrested as he sat there. "I want to cooperate," he said finally. "Smart choice. Bailiff, please arrange for Mr. Webb to be transferred to NCIS custody for debriefing." As Webb was led from the courtroom, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes addressed the remaining personnel. "The court finds that Admiral Morgan's actions were taken pursuant to lawful orders in the conduct of an authorized investigation. Not only are all charges dismissed, but Admiral Morgan is to be commended for her service in exposing a conspiracy that threatened the safety of American military personnel worldwide." The formal language couldn't capture the reality of what had just happened. A conspiracy that had been operating for years, stealing equipment and potentially getting people killed, had been exposed through an operation that required extraordinary personal sacrifice from everyone involved. This hearing is adjourned. All personnel are reminded that the contents of this proceeding remain classified at the highest levels. As the courtroom cleared, Captain Rourke approached Admiral Morgan with an expression that mixed relief, gratitude, and exhaustion. "Admiral, I can't thank you enough for what you've done. Not just for the investigation, but for my son. If that medical treatment hadn't been genuine— Captain, your son's treatment was always genuine. We made sure of that before we allowed you to accept Webb's offer. The Navy takes care of its own, especially when they're asked to put themselves at risk for the greater good. What happens now?" Chloe looked out the courtroom window toward the harbor, where gray ships rode at anchor in the morning sun. Somewhere out there, American service members were depending on equipment that might have been compromised, and there was still work to do. "Now we clean up the rest of the network," she said. "Webb was just one piece of a larger puzzle. According to our intelligence, there are similar operations at bases across the country, and possibly overseas as well." She pulled out her secure tablet and showed Rourke a map display covered with red indicators. "Each red dot represents a location where we've identified suspicious activity. Some of these operations have been running for years, stealing equipment and compromising readiness, while the people responsible get rich selling American military technology to the highest bidder." "And you're going after all of them?" "That's the plan. Operation Holdfast was just the beginning. We've proven that the conspiracy exists, identified key players, and developed methods for detecting their activities. Now comes the hard part, dismantling the entire network without alerting them to what we're doing." Defense counsel, who had been gathering his files, approached the two officers. "Admiral, I have to ask, how long have you been planning this operation?" "The planning began 8 months ago, but the preparation took much longer. I've been studying supply chain vulnerabilities for years, both as an active duty officer and in retirement. When NCIS approached me about the theft pattern, I already had a pretty good idea of how the system was being compromised. And you were willing to risk your reputation, your freedom, potentially your life, to expose it?" Chloe considered the question seriously. "Counselor, every day I was in command, I sent young people into situations where their lives depended on their equipment functioning properly. The idea that someone was compromising that equipment for profit, There's no acceptable level of risk when it comes to that kind of betrayal. As they walked out of the courthouse, the contrast with the previous day was striking. Yesterday, Chloe had been escorted in handcuffs while SEAL rookies mocked her as a failed contractor. Today, she walked out as a decorated admiral who'd just exposed a conspiracy that threatened national security. But the transformation went deeper than just public perception. The shy, nervous contractor who had endured humiliation and accusation had never really existed. In her place stood someone who'd spent decades in positions of responsibility, someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives and billions of dollars in resources. The SEAL rookies who'd been excluded from the classified session were waiting outside the courthouse, their expressions mixing curiosity with apprehension. They had heard enough rumors to know that something significant had happened, but the classified nature of the proceedings meant they had no official information. Petty Officer Morrison, who had been particularly vocal in his mockery the previous day, approached with obvious reluctance. "Ma'am," he said, "I owe you an apology. We all do. We didn't know." "Petty Officer, you reacted exactly as we expected you to react. Young warriors protecting their community from perceived threats. That's not something to apologize for." "But we were disrespectful, ma'am. We made assumptions without evidence." Chloe studied the young SEAL for a moment. He was perhaps 22 years old, fresh from training that had pushed him beyond limits he'd never imagined he possessed. His trident pin was new enough that it still gleamed, and his confidence was the kind that came from surviving challenges that eliminated 70% of candidates. "Petty Officer, what's the most important lesson they taught you in Buds?" Morrison thought for a moment. "Never quit, ma'am." "And what's the second most important lesson?" "Trust your teammates, ma'am." "Those are good lessons. But there's a third lesson that's equally important. Never assume you have all the information. The situation that looks simple on the surface often has complexities that aren't immediately visible." She gestured toward the courthouse where the classified hearing had just concluded. "Yesterday you saw a contractor accused of stealing equipment. Today, you've learned that the situation was something entirely different. The lesson isn't that you were wrong to be concerned about theft. The lesson is that gathering all the available information before making judgments is always the better approach." Morrison nodded seriously. "Yes, ma'am, we'll remember that." "See that you do. And, Petty Officer, the next time you encounter someone who doesn't fit your expectations, consider the possibility that there might be more to the story than what's immediately visible." As the group of rookies dispersed, Senior Chief Santos approached Admiral Morgan with a folder in her hands. "Admiral, I've got the preliminary analysis of the counterfeit equipment that was seized this morning. The news isn't good." Chloe opened the folder and scanned the technical report. Her expression darkened as she read. 68 items of compromised equipment currently deployed in theater? "Yes, ma'am, and that's just from this one supply chain. If similar operations are running at other installations, the number could be in the hundreds." It was a sobering reminder that while they'd won a significant victory today, the larger battle was far from over. Somewhere in Afghanistan, Iraq, or other locations where American forces were deployed, service members were depending on equipment that might fail when they needed it most. "Senior Chief, I want you to coordinate with NCIS to develop a priority list for equipment replacement. Items currently deployed in combat zones get first priority, followed by training equipment, then everything else." "Yes, ma'am. What about the personnel involved in the conspiracy?" "That's being handled through other channels. Our job is to ensure that every piece of compromised equipment is identified and replaced before someone gets hurt." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the base, Admiral Morgan found herself standing alone on the pier, looking out at the harbor, where ships of the Pacific Fleet rode at anchor. It was a view she'd enjoyed many times during her years of active service, but today it carried special significance. Operation Holdfast had succeeded beyond their most optimistic projections. The conspiracy had been exposed, key figures arrested, and the process of repairing the damage had begun. But more importantly, they'd proven that the system could police itself, that people of integrity would step forward when the mission demanded sacrifice. Her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from NCIS headquarters. The raids on Atlasware facilities had yielded massive amounts of evidence, including customer lists that revealed the scope of the international operation. What had started as a local investigation of missing equipment had uncovered a network that spanned multiple countries and involved millions of dollars in stolen military technology. But perhaps the most significant result was the change in procedures that would prevent similar conspiracies in the future. New tracking protocols, enhanced security measures, and improved oversight procedures would make it much harder for anyone to systematically compromise military equipment. As evening approached, Captain Rourke joined her on the pier. "Admiral, I just received word that my son's treatment is proceeding ahead of schedule. The doctors are optimistic about his recovery." "That's excellent news, Captain. And your career?" "Surprisingly intact. NCIS has made it clear that my cooperation was essential to the success of the operation. If anything, this experience has given me a better understanding of the threats facing our supply chain." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sunset paint the harbor in shades of orange and gold. "Captain, there's something I want you to understand about what happened here. The conspiracy we exposed wasn't just about money or equipment, it was about trust. Ma'am, every military operation depends on trust. Trust that your equipment will function, trust that your intelligence is accurate, trust that the people supporting you are committed to the mission. When that trust is betrayed, it doesn't just affect the immediate victims, it undermines the entire system. And that's why you were willing to sacrifice your reputation to expose it? Captain, my reputation is my concern. The lives of the people who depend on that equipment are everyone's concern." As they walked back toward the main base, Chloe reflected on the events of the past 2 days. Yesterday, she'd been a disgraced contractor facing serious criminal charges. Today, she was a decorated admiral who had helped expose a conspiracy that threatened national security. But the transformation had been carefully planned and executed, designed to create the exact conditions necessary to flush out the conspirators. Every moment of humiliation, every accusation, every sneer from the SEAL rookies had been calculated to convince the thieves that their operation remained undetected. The real test had been maintaining her cover while enduring treatment that would have broken most people's resolve. But 18 months of retirement had taught her that some sacrifices were worth making, and protecting the integrity of the military supply chain was definitely one of them. Her phone buzzed again with another encrypted message. This one contained deployment orders for a new assignment, heading a joint task force responsible for investigating similar conspiracies at installations worldwide. The work would be dangerous, complex, and potentially career-ending if anything went wrong. She typed back a 2-word response: "Wilco, hold fast." Within hours, teams would be mobilizing to investigate suspicious activity at bases across the country and around the world. The conspiracy exposed at Coronado was just the beginning of what promised to be a much larger operation. But tonight, for the first time in 8 months, Admiral Chloe Morgan could sleep peacefully, knowing that American service members would be a little bit safer because of the work they'd done. And in the morning, the real work of protecting them would begin again. The harbor lights reflected off the dark water as evening settled over Naval Base Coronado. Somewhere out there, ships were preparing for deployments that would take them to dangerous waters and uncertain missions. But now, at least, the people aboard those ships could trust that their equipment had been tested, verified, and proven genuine. It was a small victory in a large war, but sometimes small victories were enough to change everything.
The stories end here, but the journey continues. Many new episodes are waiting for you. And if you enjoy, please take a moment to like, subscribe to our EV Story channel, and turn on the bell.